Blanche, would you speak to this man from Johnson's?
Hello? Who is this, please? Oh, yes, Mr. Carson.
On our first episode of the podcast back in July 2021, we talked about one of my favorite films, Kiss Me Deadly. Kiss Me Deadly was one of those strange golden age films where you have to marvel that it even got made. Robert Aldrich and A.I. Bezarides wrote a screenplay that parodied the original Mickey Spillane novel. Mickey Spillane was a far-right Cold Warrior whose racism, misogyny, homophobia, and reactionary views spilled out onto the page. The king of a kind of hyper-masculine, ultraviolet, reactionary pulp crime novel. Aldrich and Bezarides' satirical treatment of Mickey Spillane's hyper-masculine, violent private eye, Mike Hammer, a radical departure even from the Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe types in Spillane's dark reactionary world.
Drop the knife! Drop the knife! Drop the knife!
Placed Ralph Meeker as Mike Hammer in an atomic age noir film where, as an ultra-violent, misogynistic relic of American anger and brutality, he ends up bumbling through a convoluted plot and finally staggering across a Malibu beach as an atomic bomb goes off in the beach house behind him. Mickey Spillane was so enraged by the film that he ended up trying to make his own Mike Hammer film, where he played Mike Hammer in a low-budget, deeply unsuccessful adaptation of The Girl Hunters. Spillane's politics were completely antithetical to A.I. Bezarides and Robert Aldrich. A.I. Bezarides was a known leftist, an Armenian-American novelist and screenwriter who had been born in Turkey. He was blacklisted in the 1950s during the time when he was adapting Kiss Me Deadly with Robert Aldrich. Aldrich came from the Rockefeller clan and was an heir to the Chase Bank fortune, and his enormously wealthy father ran one of the most powerful newspapers in Rhode Island and was Nelson Rockefeller's cousin. Originally, Robert Aldrich was bound to go into finance, majoring in economics at the University of Virginia. But while he was in college, the Great Depression happened, and Aldrich began to question his family's right-wing politics and the power they wielded. Aldrich dropped out of college to become a production clerk at RKO for $25 a week, a decision that so angered his parents that he was permanently cut off from the Aldrich fortune and written out of the will. It was written that no American director was ever born as wealthy as Robert Aldrich and then so thoroughly cut off from family money. He worked his way up the production ladder as assistant director to Charlie Chaplin for Limelight, Jean Renoir for The Southerner, and Joseph Lucy's The Prowler, as well as working with William Wellman, who would go on to direct A Star Is Born on the story of G.I. Joe. As a film director, Robert Aldrich pushed the acceptable boundaries during the production code. His films were often noir films, war films, and westerns. Genres he used to both push the level of acceptable violence under the Hays Code, but also to rework and subvert common film tropes in action films. Aldrich had a style of his own, which was noticed by Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard, and the other director critics of what would become the French New Wave. His impact on Godard was so profound that one of the most iconic images in Breathless has Jean-Paul Belmondo standing in front of a poster for Robert Aldrich's 10 Seconds to Hell. Robert Aldrich was one of the earliest American directors to be granted the coveted title auteur by the French New Wave critics. Tonight we're talking about one of Robert Aldrich's most famous and controversial films, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Aldrich was far more popular in Europe in the 1950s than McCarthy-era America. And as the mid-1950s and early 1960s came around, it was increasingly hard for him to fund his projects. Aldrich needed a comeback, and he got it with Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, as did the film's two stars, Joan Crawford and Bette Davis. Joan Crawford was good friends with Robert Aldrich. They had worked together in 1956 on the psychological drama Autumn Leaves, and they wanted to keep working together, with a whole bunch of ideas being bounced back and forth. One of the ideas that both Crawford and Aldrich had agreed to was that a movie would star both Crawford and her bête noire, Bette Davis. But for a few years, they couldn't find a suitable project, and the funding just wasn't there. Until in 1960, Henry Farrell released his gothic psychological horror novel, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, the story of two sisters, Jane and Blanche Hudson, vaudeville stars turned film actresses, who are now aging spinsters living together in an LA mansion. Jane, a former child star, is an alcoholic in mental decline, and her sister Blanche, the more famous movie actress, is in a wheelchair.
You wouldn't be able to do these awful things to me if I weren't still in this chair.
But you are, Blanche. You are in that chair.
Joan Crawford went to Bette Davis, asking her to star with her in the film adaptation in 1961. Bette Davis, who didn't know Aldrich, said she needed to meet him, asking only two questions. Are you sleeping with Joan Crawford, and will I get to play Jane? With the answers no and yes, she agreed to star in the movie. It was surprising that Joan Crawford and Bette Davis agreed to star together. Their feud is now legendary and probably the most famous in Hollywood's golden age. But the golden age was over, and Crawford and Davis's stars had both faded after they both left Warner Brothers.
And you mean all this time we could have been friends?
2 decades earlier, they were two of Warner Brothers' biggest stars, and their dressing rooms were right next door to each other. Both known for their relationships and affairs, their interests had constantly coincided with everyone from Clark Gable to Crawford's ex-husband, Franchot Tone. A huge publicity campaign for Davis's movie, The Ex-Lady, the first to have Bette Davis's name above the title, was drowned completely by Joan Crawford announcing her divorce from Douglas Fairbanks. When Bette Davis unexpectedly won her first Oscar, Joan mockingly called her dress a frock. Joan Crawford's big Oscar win for Mildred Pierce came after Bette Davis turned down the role. Bette Davis publicly mocked Joan Crawford's peace overtures as being the result of a lesbian crush. And then, when Crawford's friend Catherine Albert got into a fight with her and had a falling out, Catherine vindictively wrote the screenplay The Star about a middle-aged actress who refuses to quit, and Bette Davis signed on to play the pathetic Joan Crawford stand-in.
Come on, Oscar. Let you and me get drunk.
A decade after The Star, Crawford and Davis starred in their one and only film together, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and the feud literally exploded on set. As the Hudson sisters, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane is a film about the jealousy between two middle-aged actresses whose stars are fading. Baby Jane Hudson was a famous child vaudeville act. Her doting father was her manager. Left in the background, they pay no attention to Blanche, Jane's older sister. However, after their parents die, Jane and Blanche transition to Hollywood, where Blanche upstages her once dominant younger sister, becoming a huge starlet. Jane is stuck as an adult child star, spoiled, vindictive, and now a raging alcoholic. One night after a party, a car accident leaves Blanche paralyzed and in a wheelchair. The two sisters fade into obscurity, living in an LA mansion together, where Jane must take care of Blanche. However, decades of alcohol abuse have taken their toll on Jane's already fragile mind. What ensues is a psychological horror movie. And on set, what ensued was essentially also a similar type of psychological horror movie. Some deeply insane and petty fighting, including Bette Davis buying a Coca-Cola machine for the set because Joan Crawford was sitting on the board of Pepsi. Joan Crawford having to get stitches after a fight scene with Bette Davis. Joan Crawford retaliating, filling her pockets with rocks, and maybe even wearing a lead weightlifting belt, so Bette Davis would wrench her back trying to drag her, and then coughing to ruin the take, so she'd have to do it again and again. Crawford and Davis both called Robert Aldrich every night to complain about each other. However, the results of their feuding, the hatred, the on-screen tension is amazing. You can feel it radiating from the screen, sucking you into it. Baby Jane feeds her sister both her pet bird and a rat, and somehow it doesn't feel off-brand for the actual set. Robert Aldrich has an intrinsic understanding of how the modern 1960s LA fashion and culture clashes so hard with this moth-bitten vaudevillian early 20th century style, becoming deeply unsettling. The film also introduced the actor Victor Buono as the scheming con man piano player Edwin Flagg. Tying this all together, back to the beginning, both Wesley Addy and Maxine Cooper, who starred in Kiss Me Deadly, make appearances in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and the same beach where Mike Hammer fled from the atomic bomb is the same beach where Baby Jane and Blanche finally get caught by police at the end of this film. Buono and Bette Davis would both end up being nominated for Oscars, but not Joan Crawford. Behind the scenes, riddled with jealousy, Joan Crawford campaigned against Bette Davis's Best Actress win and schemed with other actresses, including Anne Bancroft, to collect their awards on their behalf, thereby upstaging Davis again. Neither Bette Davis nor Victor Buono ended up winning an Oscar that year.